garden of Harlem Renaissance poet Anne Spencer. It served as a refuge from the injustices of the segregated times in which she lived. It was also a source of inspiration for her poetry. What you see today is a restoration of the garden as it appeared in the 1930s.
I plant the thorn and kiss the rose, but they will grow when I am dead. You could tell that the place had been loved. There were some little treasures. You know, here and there I recognized the peony foliage and, of course, the iris. And it spoke to me. My job was to convince the Garden Club that this was a worthwhile thing for them to undertake. They had never been here. They'd never been on this side of town. One by one, I brought them over and we walked through the garden and the bench was still there. And we'd sit on the bench. So that took the entire summer of 1981 to do. And it was unanimously adopted, which was a very exciting moment.
We had rules in this garden, only 3 rules. The funny thing about my grandmother was that she didn't have any rules in the house.
Oh, but she had rules in the garden.
And so the 3 rules in the garden were we could not play in the pond.
Right.
We could not eat the grapes because the grapes were for the purple martins.
Okay, okay.
And we couldn't pick the flowers. We could smell them and enjoy them and look at them.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, every once in a while she may cut a couple of flowers to put into the house or to put on her desk in the cottage. But most of the time, the flowers were in the garden for everyone to enjoy.
This garden was part of her soul, and she was such a famous Harlem Renaissance poet.
What I consider this to be sometimes they call them a Harlem satellite.
Yes.
Lynchburg was one of those places where Harlem came out of Harlem, New York, and went elsewhere. There were satellites in Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, and New York, and L.A., and in Lynchburg.
And in Lynchburg.
And some people will ask me, did Anne Spencer ever live in Harlem? And I said, no, she never lived in Harlem. But Harlem came to Anne Spencer.
So tell me about the very famous guests that came to enjoy this garden with your grandmother.
Goodness, that from W.E.B. Du Bois sending down James Weldon Johnson for the NAACP establishment that happened right here in the living room at 1313 Pierce Street, to some of the younger writers like Langston Hughes and Sterling A. Brown and others that weren't writers, like people who were in floriculture and agriculture, like George Washington Carver.
Yes.
Politicians like Thurgood Marshall and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. honeymooned here with his wife Isabel. They enjoyed this garden. They were mostly other than Du Bois, from the South. And I imagine when they came here, this reminded them of their home, of the lush greenness that they left behind for the concrete world.
As I read your grandmother's poetry, the trees, the shrubs, the flowers, they're just woven through it. This garden was just such an inspiration. Where did she write her poetry?
She wrote her poetry everywhere, but mostly she would write here in the garden. So it's known, of course, as the Anne Spencer Garden, but my grandfather and grandmother enjoyed this garden together. My grandfather, Edward, and Anne, which is why it's named, the garden is Edencrawl. It is a combination of their 2 first names, E.D. for Edward, A.N. for Anne, and then crawl is a South African word, also a Dutch word, could be in other languages as well. But for them it meant corral or enclosure or place. So it's Ed and Anne's place.
Fantastic.
And when we as the family referred to the garden or the cottage, we're talking about Edencrawl. Inside is her desk and her chair, and there's windows that she has views into the garden. You can read her garden. You can read that she's writing about things that are planted in this garden. She's writing about that this garden is half her world. She's inspired by what she's seen outside those windows.
Over time, this garden fell into disrepair, and Chauncey, your father, he wanted to restore it. He loved this garden.
It was soon after the house became a Virginia Historic Landmark and listed on the National Register in '77. So now it's the 80s. So at that point, the foundation, we're 501c3, there's a board of directors. And they've done some restoration even in the house at that point.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing tours
Yes.
of the house. But the garden, my father said, I want the garden to be like I remember it. He started gathering pictures, and my sister Kyle and I, we were at the dining room table with him, and he had all these photographs, you know, of my grandparents' home.
Yes.
And so he says, just pick out the pictures that have people in the garden and are of the garden. So that's really how it started. He shared those photographs, and Jane fell in love with it. So they went to the garden club, Hillside Garden Club, and the ladies agreed to take this on as a project under the Garden Club of Virginia. And they've won 2 Commonwealth Awards for their wonderful restoration work here.
I can see why. This is excellent.
This arbor and pergola that's behind me is part of that restoration, constructed architecturally in the same footstep as my grandfather constructed it. But it was only from those photographs that we were able to do that.
I noticed when I pulled up, I could just walk down into this garden. Do you have a lot of people that just come here and walk the garden and leave? Because it is a public garden.
It's a public garden. We want people to do that, and you can. You just park your car on Pierce Street. It's open sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week. We have Wi-Fi, and we encourage people to stay here as long as they like. We're raising funds for a new visitor center, and we're naming that Pop's Chicken House for all this wonderfulness that my grandfather has done for us in building this house and building the cottage and the garden and the structures. We're naming that after Edward. That will give us public restrooms and a facility where we can have spaces for our educational programming.
When you walk through this garden, how does it make you feel? What do you think about?
I think about when I was a little girl, very often. You know, playing in this garden, and with the fun we had here in this garden, and my grandmother, you know, in this garden. Sometimes she wasn't here with us because, there were 8 children in my family, and I'm number 7. So I was one of the youngest at the time. So when we're coming here, she's already in her 80s,
Yes.
you know. But I remember, when I come to that gate, I remember being this tall, and the flowers being everywhere. The flowers that are planted here on the border are to give you a sense of what the garden looked like, what was planted here.
This lush, full planting.
And you can the height of them. You can see, as a 5 or 6 year old,
Yes.
And some of them are Ann Spencer's original plantings, and some of them are plantings that you would have seen in a garden in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s.
Well, sitting here, Sean, I can almost feel your grandmother. And it's a really good feeling. And to know that so many people and so many hands have worked together throughout the community to raise this garden up, what an accomplishment. What an enormous accomplishment, and a community-based accomplishment. And I'm sure your family is just so proud to be able to emulate and to shine not the garden, but also the story of your grandmother.
Thank you, Peggy. It's so wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for coming and spending some time here in the Ann Spencer Garden.